Hello, just a quick update from me, bonus material if you will. Following lecture 2, I've had the same question asked a few times, which is good, I really enjoy that. And it's great the way you're thinking. So I just wanted to offer an explanation to that question for everybody rather than answer people individually. The question is this, when we talked about flight deck design or workspace design, we talked about auditory warning systems, so warning systems which use noise as a cue. We're talking about the Helios 737 accident and where the crew misinterpreted a warning because it used the same noise, the system used the same noise to indicate a takeoff configuration warning as it did a depressurization warning. The question came at me, why don't we use spoken words, i.e. verbal information as a warning or as offering a piece of information into the cockpit? And that's a really good question, and the answer is we kind of do, but we don't want to do it too much. Just taking a pause there and thinking back to why it wasn't the case in the 737, that is a very old aeroplane, and actually technically it didn't, in terms of the technology and the systems on board, it didn't have the capability to produce spoken word warnings or information in the cockpit when it first came into service. Later versions probably had the option, but it hasn't been adopted very widely, apart from in a small area, which I'll show you in just a moment. But it's a good idea, right? We want, when we play a noise, a tone, that alerts us that something is of interest, but intrinsically it doesn't contain any information itself. We have to then couple that with our memory of what that tone means. Through training, we might know that a certain buzz means that the aeroplane is overspeeding, but we have to do that internally in our brains, whereas a spoken word warning intrinsically contains that information. If the audio tells me warning terrain, well, I don't even have to process, I don't have to retrieve anything from a long-term memory. That is all I need to know, and I can act there on in. We can take that too far, though. Presumably we could start having auditory information that would announce the entire performance of the aeroplane or have huge spoken sentences, and that could be quite a distraction. So there is a balancing point, and that's really the compromise in terms of when a designer has a choice about how they issue a warning using auditory information. Small pieces of spoken information are good. Long pieces of spoken information or verbal information are probably better communicated in text because they're transient. They are there when they're being spoken and then they disappear, whereas text can sit there. It's actually an incredibly detailed and complicated issue, which I'm very happy to talk to you about, but I just want to illustrate it with a couple of videos. So shortly before McDonnell Douglas, the manufacturer of aeroplanes, went bust, or was subsumed by Boeing in the middle of the 90s, they developed their last couple of aeroplanes with quite a sophisticated auditory warning suite. So the MD-11, which was a trijet, and the MD-95, which went on to be the Boeing 717, both had what I would say are quite sophisticated spoken word auditory warning and information systems. This cockpit video, which I show, is actually a simulator for the MD-11, but it illustrates what is one of the most common spoken information features in pretty much any modern airliner, which is the radio altimeter callouts on approach to a runway. Rather than a series of tones to tell us how far above the runway we are, it actually speaks out the altitude that the aeroplane is at that time. So it doesn't tell you just that you're approaching a key altitude, it tells you what the altitude is so you can make some sense of it. So just watch this.
100, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
Yeah. Most large airliners have that same system on and have chosen that mode of delivery of information. The MD-11 and 717/MD-95 fleet's auditory warning system was far more sophisticated than that even, and they chose to use voice to cue the pilot to a lot of things, including when the stabilizer was moving, when the autopilot disconnected. In most airliners, in most aircraft nowadays, that's just a tone. In those aeroplanes, it was spoken as autopilot, so you didn't just hear something randomly disconnect and then have to associate that with being the autopilot. It told you it was the autopilot, thus reducing confusion. I think that was quite sensible. However, for various reasons, subsequent airliner designs have not adopted such a detailed spoken auditory warning suite. Go and look at military aircraft and it's a different game, but this is going to get into a very detailed conversation. So to keep it simple, all I'll say is, yes, we can use the spoken word. It has its benefits, but we need to be careful that actually we're not introducing more of a distraction when we do that. So to illustrate that point, just have a look at the rest of the video which I started showing you, where the aeroplane simulates a fault on the ground, which is all of its tyres exploding. I think there's about 18 tyres on the MD-11. See how the auditory warning suite informs the pilot of that condition.
Tire failure, 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 tire
All
failure,
tires.
tire failure, tire failure, tire failure.
Yeah, that's probably suboptimal. That's I'm sure you can appreciate that's a bit of a distraction. In this case, mainly because, not because of the auditory announcement itself, because each tyre warning cue is quite small, but because of the logic of the warning system. All it did was it detected a simultaneous failure of 18 tyres and stacked the warnings one after the other and played them sequentially, which means that you've got this noise going on in the background. And when we talk about information processing, because it's all spoken words, it means you are more likely to have to process that information without being able to not process that information, therefore it's more of a distraction. So there are pros and cons, and we've got to be very careful when we choose to use spoken word in the cockpit. And like I said, there's far, far more considerations than I'm outlining just here. Happy to speak to you about them, but I'm also appreciating that probably a lot of you don't care that much. This is just my particular geeky area. But yeah, no, good question, well asked, and happy to discuss it further. All right, see you in week 3.